And we're live, guys. This is Good Morning Liberty here on YouTube. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center. Thank you so much for tuning in. It is 9:30 a.m. today, Wednesday, August the 1st. So good morning to you, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, whenever you're watching this. Really appreciate you being here with us, as this is our second edition of, I guess, what we can call Good Morning Liberty Beta. We're giving this kind of a test run. I'm going to keep doing these probably every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday to share with you some thoughts about important issues of the day, either current events or tying them into constitutional viewpoints, or just viewpoints talking about liberty. So today I want to cover a few different things, pretty tightly related at least at the beginning. First of all, 3D printed guns. I think that's a pretty hot topic to cover today. Following from there, we're going to talk about the undetectable federal it's a federal law, the Undetectable Firearms Act of 1988, something that a lot of people don't know, I think, even exists, but it definitely comes into play again today. And then I also want to get into something that's kind of what I would consider the last line of defense, and that is jury nullification. It's actually happening once again, this time down in Georgia. So let's get over to our stories for the day. And the first one, 3D printed guns. This is the website over here is from Defense Distributed. You can see this big notification on the front of their website, August 1st, 2018. Defense Distributed relaunches DefCAD after reaching a settlement agreement with the U.S. Department of State, concluding a multi-year federal lawsuit. The age of the downloadable gun begins. Well, it's already been there. But there's a lot of moving parts in this story. Back in 2015, Cody Wilson started creating the 380 Liberator. It's a single-shot 380 3D printable gun, and the State Department came down on him and basically wanted them to stop. So there's then been this lawsuit, and they finally reached an agreement to let the files out. But yesterday, as we see in the Seattle Times here, a federal judge blocks the release of these blueprints. So they said, you can't do this. I think it's probably a smart move for them to back down, because how else are they going to keep doing this? But there's some interesting twists to this story. So yesterday, U.S. District Court Judge Robert Lasnik in Seattle issued a temporary restraining order blocking the release of downloadable blueprints for 3D firearms. The ruling comes a day after Washington State Attorney General Bob Ferguson filed a suit challenging the Trump administration's decision to allow the release of the blueprints. So that actually brings me over to the Undetectable Firearms Act of 1988. And this is a blog that I did on it that published earlier this morning. And I was just scrolling through Twitter. I use an app called TweetDeck, so I have all these different columns that show things flying by. And there was a tweet that came up from Vin Armani. He does a weekly show here on YouTube, and he had noted that the NRA posted a tweet talking about the 3D printed guns, and I went and read it, and they're bragging about getting another federal gun control law passed. So this is what I wrote in the blog. Yesterday, in response to fears from gun control advocates over 3D printed firearm blueprints becoming more widely available today, the NRA posted a tweet noting that the organization helped pass a federal gun control measure called the Undetectable Federal Firearms Act, the Undetectable Firearms Act of 1988. So this went through and it passed the House by a huge margin. It was 413 to 4. And then it went to the Senate. It got some minor amendments, went back to the House, and it was passed unanimously in the House. The amendments were, and it went and it was signed by President Ronald Reagan, all with the full support of the NRA. And this is their tweet. So a lot of people are asking NRA, of course, well, what's your thoughts on this whole Undetectable Firearms Act? These 3D printable files that are going to be out in the wild, is it dangerous or what? And Chris Cox, he says, federal law passed in 1988, crafted with the NRA's support, makes it unlawful to manufacture, import, sell, ship, deliver, possess, transfer, or receive an undetectable firearm. And my view is pretty straightforward, and the 10th Amendment Center's view is pretty straightforward. The Second Amendment is the Second Amendment. It means what it says, and the words are just, you don't read into it. It's pretty straightforward, and there is no exception in the Second Amendment for undetectable firearms. The founders did not write the Second Amendment to say the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed unless their firearms cannot be discovered. At that time, what would that have required? I mean, if you think about it, they didn't have metal detectors and things like that, so they weren't even concerned about whether or not the government would be able to determine whether or not someone had a gun. The whole point was that they wanted the government to realize that anybody could have a gun, because that's what keeps government at bay when you really get down to it. So this federal judge issued the restraining order blocking it. And of course, what this Undetectable Firearms Act was a big part of that. So here's a quote from the USA Today. No, maybe it was the Seattle Times, one of these mainstream awful places. But the people filing the complaint, they worry that lax control of plastic guns is a public safety issue and would sidestep current regulations. Well, what's the current regulation? It's the Undetectable Firearms Act. I keep calling it that. See, this is what live is all about. I'm going to screw up. I can't edit it, so hopefully you can follow along and it's not too bad. Hey, Richard, I'm glad to see you. I'm glad to see you here in the chat, and you're asking about Defense Distributed's website. Well, they had, as you can see it here, now let me go back to it. It shows this August 1, 2018. When you go full screen with it, they've actually flipped this upside down. It flips it upside down. It's almost like an upside down flag, distress call. But when I switched it to a smaller size so it could fit on this broadcast, then it shows it right side up. I was going to have to try to figure it out to try to read it upside down, but luckily it popped back up. And hi to Eric out there as well. Do you believe the state governments have the ability to limit gun rights so long as they remain within the bounds of their own state constitution? This is a really long conversation that gets into the incorporation doctrine under the 14th Amendment. I'm going to recommend that people read Dave Benner's book, The 14th Amendment and the Incorporation Doctrine. The Second Amendment, as originally understood, only applied to the federal government. I think we also need to separate the idea that the Second Amendment doesn't grant us rights. The right to keep and bear arms is a natural right, and any violation of that right is any limitation on the right to keep and bear arms, any gun control, whether it's state, local, or federal. These are a violation of your natural right to keep and bear arms, to defend yourself, your family, your property. It's not about hunting. It's about self-defense. Now, does the federal Constitution, or is the federal Constitution the right place to try to enforce that? I would say the federal government can't be trusted to do it. And their track record, once the incorporation doctrine really started to come into play in the early 1920s, has been really bad. And you can go and look at most of the federal gun laws on the books came after that. So once you centralize the power, I think the rights will always be diluted. And I think we have some pretty good history on that to show how that plays out. You have the National Firearms Act of 1934, the Gun Control Act of 68, the amendments in 86, and of course the Undetectable Firearms Act of 1988, which no one seems to think about much until now, when people can make these undetectable firearms. And I know that a lot of the earlier blueprints for the 3D guns were trying to do a sidestep around this by having metal parts, but opponents or gun control activists, they're never satisfied. So, of course, they recognize that the metal parts can be removed and then the gun can still be used as plastic, can't be traced, there's no serial numbers, there's no background checks. That's exactly the way it's supposed to be, no background checks. Now, Eric is asking about the incorporation doctrine. I really appreciate your kind words. I completely agree with your analysis of it. This was the very short version, and people much smarter than me are better. The guy's name name is Dave Benner, and the book is The 14th Amendment and the Incorporation Doctrine. I'm going to see if I can get a link here. Here it is. We have it over at members.10thamendmentcenter.com. It's a free download. I'm not sure how many pages, maybe 30 pages, 24 pages. So this is a really interesting book talking about how the Bill of Rights was intended to apply to the federal government and not the states. And of course, we can go even further and talk about how making the federal government the protector of liberty and the final determiner of what's right and wrong has been really bad. But I think that's a bit of a side discussion. It's a really great question, Eric. Thank you so much for asking about that. So back to the 3D printed guns and the Undetectable Firearms Act. So there's this temporary restraining order. We don't know exactly how it's going to go. I think the most important part is that the files are already out in the wild. And in this blog that I wrote earlier today, or had published earlier today, or actually wrote it yesterday, I went through a little bit of the history of Defense Distributed. And back in 2015, in May, they made public the 3D printable files for the world's first fully 3D printable gun, the Liberator 380 single-shot pistol. Now, as I mentioned before, the State Department came after them, and they said, hey, you got to stop this. There's some UN treaties. There's this Undetectable Firearms Act, blah, blah, blah. Defense Distributed backed down after they had already had the files up for a couple of days. But this created what we call the Streisand effect, and you can look that up on Wikipedia if you don't know what it is. And basically what happened was, because of the attention of having the files pulled down, this brought a lot of eyes to the idea. And once the files are up, people are sharing them on other websites like the Pirate Bay or BitTorrent, mostly torrent websites, where it becomes virtually impossible to stop. And by the time that Defense Distributed had taken those files down for the Liberator back in 2015, at least from our research, they were downloaded over 100,000 times. So 100,000 times. Now, over the last 3 years, we know they've been downloaded way more times than that. But the fact that the feds were backing off on this and saying, okay, you can go publicly available, this is going to bring a lot of attention. It makes it more mainstream. Not everyone is willing to download stuff unless they have permission to. Unfortunately, I wish more people would start asking exercising their rights without first getting permission from the federal government. But this Streisand effect really went on. And from there, and I note this in the blog post as well, just weeks after they went online, a guy in Wisconsin, which is my original home state, took the original design and turned it from a single shot into an 8-round gun. This is the market at work, innovating and making it better, improving on it. And then a few weeks after that, another person printed a rifle. Now, there are other sites, and I have to double-check to see how many of these are still clocking, but FOSCAD, GrabCAD, and then, of course, Defense Distributed made DefCAD. And they have a number of other firearms available. Their blueprints include a 1911, a Beretta M9, Ruger 1022, I think an AR-15 you can do as well. And this is huge. Now, before that temporary restraining order came in late yesterday, I think it was around 3 p.m. Pacific time here on the West Coast, DefCAD already had the files available. They put them up, and some other sites put them up, and at least on the DefCAD website, we counted it up. They tabulate, and you can see here, all these, you got the AR-15, a VZ-58, the Liberator. If you add up all the downloads, which you can't get from DefCAD or Defense Distributed anymore, an AR-10, was over 25,000 times. So the genie is out of the bottle. You can't put the genie back in. Once information is available to the public with the internet and modern technology, it cannot be stopped. Now, the NRA likes to tell us that this is illegal. So there's gun control advocates. It's almost like they're playing into the hands. They're making statements to appease the gun control people instead of trying to educate them on how this advances humanity. This is a human right, and getting permission to exercise that right means it isn't a right. It's a permission slip. It's a privilege. So the right to keep and bear arms, not the privilege or the blessing or the gift from government to keep and bear arms. That's how they're Yeah, Richard is saying here in the chat too, and thanks, Richard. I really appreciate the feedback. They said there is already a reactionary site that provides all the files. Want the link? Yes, please post it in the chat. I was trying to find this. I saw when I was researching this, I saw a report at NBC News that said there was a number of gun rights organizations that had said that they were going to put the files up as well as a protest. But of course, the link on the NBC News site didn't link to that. And I'm sure I could have found it with some more Googling. But if you've got the link available, Richard, please post it, and I will do my best to get that out. So again, 25,000 times already from DefCAD. It's available. Another group has made it available. It's going up on torrent sites. We know the first time around in 2015, before there was a lot of news about this, it had already been downloaded over 100,000 times. So this cannot be stopped. And as my new friend Michael Heiss of the Libertarian Party Mises Caucus said a few weeks ago, hey, and I think this is really a rallying call, print guns, not money. And that's a really good way to advance more freedom. So back to this blog post that I did. Oh, Alan Mosley stopped in, complaining that I'm starting to stream when he's recording. Well, I guess we're going to have to start coordinating it a little bit better, Alan. Thanks for stopping by, though. Watch it on the replay. Leave me some comments, man. And thanks so much for stopping by. So the blog that I was talking about, again, the Streisand effect, the files are out there. And as Cody Wilson says, I think access to firearms is a fundamental human right. This is extremely important, and the genie is out of the bottle. They cannot actually stop it. Even though the NRA is actually taking the wrong position on this, like they have on a number of other federal gun laws, they're taking the total wrong position that it's illegal to do. The question is, when enough people start doing it anyways, even if they can make the files, the NRA is saying, oh, it's still illegal to possess them or produce them. But the printer, I think, is one of the files that DefCAD is making available. You can almost print the printer. I'm not 100% sure. Someone maybe can correct me on that. So people have access to the files. If they determine that they need to be able to print these firearms to protect themselves, and they're willing to do so without government permission, then these so-called federal laws and many others, federal, even state and local, they will be rendered moot if enough people say no to them and take action to exercise their rights without government permission. So our next story here, I want to move on to, I'm not sure what this is going on in the video here. Let me switch over. Hopefully I can get that. Here we go. Okay. Torpy at large at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. This report. Man grows pot, admits it, and then the jury sends him home. This is called jury nullification. First, I got to get a little coffee here. It's an absolute must. So, Giovanni McCoy was growing marijuana when the cops came to his Middle Georgia home. He was caught red-handed with it, almost a pound of it. He admitted it to police, and later he looked jurors in the eye and said, "Yup, it was mine. I used it as medicine." But the jury acquitted him because the jury can judge not only the facts of the case, but the law itself. This is when people vote to acquit, even though they recognize that the law on the books has been violated. And this is starting to happen. So they said the jurors let him go. He was minding his own business and wasn't hurting anybody. He just doesn't belong in prison. So he made an honest case that he was using the marijuana for medicine, and that is not legal in Georgia. But this jury said, okay, we're not going to throw him in jail anyways. And the lawyer, Catherine Bernard, she's now getting a bit of her name for herself in supporting jury nullification. I know she has said, and even says in this report here, she doesn't like that term because, well, I don't know. Maybe it just has a negative connotation down there in Georgia. I'm not sure. But that's exactly what it is, because and this is why I call it the last line of defense, and that's what I was mentioning right at the beginning. This is the last line of defense. So even if all other efforts to stop a federal act or a local act, whether it's voting bums out, going to court, a legislation to nullify on a state or a local level, even if all that fails, and someone gets arrested and thrown in a cage, locked up, going to be kept there for however many years, their lives destroyed, the jury can still say, okay, yeah, you violated the law, but I'm voting not guilty or voting to acquit. And that's extremely important. I think it's so important, and I think I'm really glad to see this happening. I saw an article over at Reason that was talking about this recently as well. But this is so important because even if it's not only being used primarily on marijuana cases, I think people are going to start recognizing, wow, this is the way to protect someone's rights, and this will hopefully have some kind of a Streisand effect as well, where jurors go into these types of situations recognizing that if someone is literally just exercising their rights and not causing harm or committing fraud on other people, that they actually have it in their conscience to say, no, I'm not going to convict this person. And all it takes is one honest person to change things around. So kudos to Catherine Bernard there in Georgia for taking a stand. Whether she calls it jury nullification or she calls it the Easter Bunny, I don't care. The end result is that people can stay free without changing the law. I mean, this is, again, it's the last line of defense. It's a big part of the puzzle if you put all these things together, whether it's making files available online, if people start printing guns, and someone gets arrested for, even though they had the files, they say, the NRA wants to tell us again that having these undetectable firearms is illegal. Well, couldn't a jury still then acquit them? Absolutely. And I think it's important to really push this as another measure to protect people's rights. Again, one more thing before we go. I know you guys have been with me for quite a little time here. I actually planned on doing this for about 15 minutes, but the first one I think was closer to 30. Now we're again over 20 minutes. So thank you so much for watching. And of course, if you like what we're doing here, make sure to smash the likes. Hitting the like button tells YouTube that, well, of course, you like this broadcast, and therefore it's more likely that their algorithm will show the archive of it or even the live stream to other people that they determine might like as well. So smash those likes and, of course, leave comments. Thanks to everyone so far in the chat. I want to quickly mention the quote of the day, which I think goes hand in hand with what's going on with the 3D printed guns, with the jury nullification down in Georgia. A free people, and this is from Thomas Jefferson, a free people claim their rights as derived from the laws of nature and not as the gift of their chief magistrate. Liberty is not about getting a permission slip. Liberty is exercising your rights is not about waiting for a federal court or a federal politician or a state politician or a state court to say, okay, you can exercise your rights. Liberty is not about having a permission slip to conceal carry. That is not, although it's better than probably in many situations, it's better than the status quo. That is, getting permission is not the same thing. So as Jefferson noted, when you're really free, you take your rights, you exercise them, and you don't act as these things are gifts from your government. So I just want to thank everyone for watching again, whether you're watching us here live or on the archive. I really enjoyed doing this episode. I hope you learned a little bit of something. I know I did about the 3D printed files being available, where we got a link posted. Thank you for putting that out there, Richard. I really appreciate it. But I hope you enjoyed this, you learned something, and if you have a topic that you think I should cover, so far I'm going to keep going with Monday, Wednesday, Friday of these episodes. If there's a topic you want me to cover on Friday or next week, just leave it in the comments, and of course, smash the likes, help us spread the word, and have a great day. I really appreciate you being here with us.